Hey,
Welcome to Syracuse JavaScript Office Hours. This is where we will be talking about JavaScript questions from the world and answering them. Tonight, there are 3 questions that we'll be going into, and we will have one guest to speak to the third one. I will go through the first 2 and then take it from there. Now, this is not a professional setup. We are all coders in this community in Syracuse, and that means that it's an easy thing to ask any question that you care to. The way that you do that is to join the Slack. And to do that, I will share the screen. So to join Slack, you go to syracuse.io. You go down to the little Slack button, and then you type in your email. You're all set from that point. Check it out when you can. Join the other 357 developers, and then in the channel for JavaScript, ask your question once a month. I'll run through and go into them. Great. With that said, the first question is, should I be using webpack with modules, Babel, and SCSS on projects that aren't using a framework? I ask because I've gone through a React course and built a few React projects with a tutorial, but I've decided I need to take a step back and build a few projects without a framework first. Not sure if I should be using webpack for these projects or not. So we have to understand the question to be about when to use webpack and also when to learn webpack. And those depend on who you are. So that question appears to be from a developer who's curious to work without a framework as a way to get educated on JavaScript. That's a sensible way to start. It's a sensible way to understand what is pure JavaScript as compared to what is added on by the framework with its conventions. So whether you use Webpack or not, with or without a framework, every single framework is going to have some type of Webpack in it these days. I'll say that certainly about Angular and React, and with some uncertainty about what Vue does and what others do. So when you're using a framework, what do you need to know about Webpack when you're using Angular in the CLI? And what do you need to know about Webpack when you're using a Create React app? Next to nothing. You can do a large-scale enterprise application without ever touching Webpack with Angular. With a Create React app in React, you can only do Webpack if you make a irreversible change called ejection. So the idea is that as somebody working with JavaScript in the beginning, and the idea that you're working with a framework in the beginning, those people that develop them find it the value of understanding and working with Webpack is built into the framework. It's not for the developer who's using the framework to mess around with. The reason for Webpack, you could use Angular, for example, and one way that they use Webpack is for the Webpack development server. When you run ng serve, you're running a Webpack development server that's been tailored in one way or another for Angular. So it's not something that's necessary for building a front-end application. It's necessary for working and developing. behind the scenes. So if you're a front-end developer, it's possible that Webpack stays a behind-the-scenes tool for you. It is, in effect, something that the developers of the framework need and use in order to build and work with the framework. So, do you need to learn to use Webpack in order to develop code without a framework? I would say against it. I would be in favor of, if you're not learning to use a framework and you are learning JavaScript without a framework, to focus on just the core conventions of JavaScript and treat Webpack like you would learning a framework. It has its own intricacies and its own set of conventions. And when you're curious to work with Webpack, you can go about that. Yet, assuming you're curious to be a front-end developer, and I'll say for myself, I am not somebody who spends a lot of time in Webpack, though I will show an example of when I did at one point use Webpack. You do not need to have Webpack knowledge in order to work with React, in order to work with Angular, in order to work with Vue, nor do you need it if you're working without a framework. When you're doing something more custom, and if you're trying to emphasize developing your own tooling, Webpack's right there for you. Let's look at an example of where Webpack has come into my world. So I have to open up my terminal and show you guys a client project. So cd code client SIS GUI. I'll only open up the Webpack file so as to not get bogged down into other bits. This Webpack config, it has got a tremendous, 337 lines. There's complexity to it. The exports here takes in an env and then does some configuration. So I'll do, by way of collapsing, a quick run through this file. So we have an unpacking of the env, some logic, and some comments related to it. The creation of a plugin, we have a configuration object. We have some conditionals based on some of the exports, and that's that. So what have I done within this file is to work with the production variable. This line here, in the plugins section, we're defining a new plugin. As a key, the word production is exposed to the application that's being interactive with the Webpack config. If the environment variable that was passed in to this Webpack file has a production variable, then set the value of the global production to be true. If not, set it to be false. Where this matters is that in the runtime, I would like to know that this application was in production mode or not. It's a very specific use case. The only bit of this file that I modified was this one line, 277. And that is the extent to which, when building a large Angular application, Webpack has mattered. And mileage will vary, mileage may vary. In the situation direct to working with Webpack without a framework, I would not go down that route until you've gotten yourself more familiar with JavaScript and your specific case demands it. As the moment you start to work with frameworks, a lot of the Webpack work will have been done for you, and that is it. So we'll move on to the next question. And the next question will be worth exploring for the entirety of it in console, because it is a fun one to go through that has some serious implications for using and understanding JavaScript. Let's get into it. And I can tell you that the question is also explored in other places on the web in certain ways. It becomes something of a punchline in JavaScript that truthiness and falsiness exist. And it's really possible in a weakly typed language to have what we're going to go through. The question is, for what reason does the left side of this evaluate as true when compared to the string nerd, capital N, lowercase ERD? And it all comes down to falsy checking. It comes down to weak typing. It gets down to some things that get commented on as silly in JavaScript. And I'll take it step by step. So if you look at this piece of it, this is where the N is coming from. If you look at this piece of it, this is where the E is coming from. If you look at this piece of it, this is where the R is coming from. And this piece is going to be where the D is coming from. I'm going to strip away everything after where the N comes from and talk to how this ends up evaluating to N in a piece-by-piece way. So you'll notice that there are two plus signs here. There is plus, which is being used as an addition operator. And then there's also a plus that's being used to cast a string to, cast a number to a string. And I'll start with that. So let me put this up in the URL just for safekeeping and do this. Here's the number 1. We'll say let x equal to 1. So when we evaluate x, it is going to be equal to 1. If we do a plus x, you get that. If I do, oh, I have to walk into this from a different direction, and again state that the plus is for when you've got a string and you need to cast it out to a number. So we'll say x is equal to the string, which is 1, and then do plus 1. And what it's showing you is that when it evaluates to the number 1. So to be clear about this in another way is to say, what is the value of x? You can see in console, it's going to print out 1, and it's in a string. And then if you do plus x, what is the value that gets consoled is a number. So now we've casted from a number, from a string to a number. Let's look at what an array is. An array will evaluate to an array. What a plus array will evaluate to is a 0. If you take that piece here, now we're at a 0. If we take what is 0 at the 0 index, it's undefined. All right. So we've gotten to the point where we're at undefined up there. And now we're doing an addition from what is a undefined plus a empty string. So if we type undefined plus an empty string, what do we get? We get it to be a string. And then when we get that string undefined and take what there is the index at 2, we get a D. So we've got a D. Let's look at the original copy paste job from the Slack. Copy that. All right. We wanted that to be an N. And here it's an N. There it is not. What is different? Let's look at it. There's a parentheses in here. So if we take what we did before which is evaluate to the point that undefined is there, you still get your D. So let's go through that and work out where the error is at. We got the empty array. You want to know where it's at 0. That gives you what you'd expect. And then you get to the string, and then you get the N. So you get nan. Oh, okay. So let's look at how these get evaluated. What is array at 0? Array at 0 is undefined. Plus undefined gives you nan. And then we evaluate nan there. This is all a result of precedent. So the first thing that gets evaluated is what is directly to the left of that unary plus, undefined. And then the unary plus is tacked on to give you nan, and then the empty string gives you nan as a string. So the peculiarities of at which point in time any of this gets evaluated, and for what reason adding an empty string to a value like nan or undefined gives you that version as a string are trivial. This is all part of the sort of joke of the question is, why does this have some translation to this? Clearly, programming and programmers day to day are not ever needing to evaluate this. What we reveal in this anyway is this plus operator, which a lot of utility exists in. To do this is more brief than to do another form of going from a string to a number, which is to do a parse int with a base 10. And parse int has value when you're working with hexadecimal and so on, but you usually aren't. So you can learn from this that occasionally you're going to get a number from your database. You might have some object that's a response body from the server, and it'll have an ID on it, and that ID will be a string, and you'll have a value on it, and that ID will be, that value will be a number, and it'll also be as a type of string. And you want to do some math on it. So we'll picture that we have 2 bodies. So we can do let bodies is be an array where the first one is a body and the second one's a body. So when we've got our bodies, it's there. And we want to do some math on those values. So we want to add up the value of the first one. We say value plus bodies value. And what do we get is a syntax error. That was an unexpected punchline. Here it is. 25, 25. When you add 25 and 25, you're really expecting a 50. But what you've done is concatenated 2 strings and not evaluated math. So when you're in that situation, the most straightforward way to handle it, they're strings. You can add your unary operators to cast them to be numbers. Now you get the math that you would think. So the first bit of this is understanding that unary plus. So we've got ourselves an M. Let's work to get a E. We've got an E. All right. Let's break it down like we did before, starting with the array and then adding a couple of not operators, negation, logical negation. You see a double bang when you're attempting to coerce something's truthy value strictly into a Boolean. So 0, not 0 is true, because in JavaScript, not 0 being loosely equal to false is accurate. 0 is falsy, false is falsy, and when you're using equality checks that are not strict, which is when you do a double equal, it evaluates to true. If you triple equal it, it'll be false. So now you've got something that's falsy being strictly compared to something that is literally false. What you would do when you wanted to know that this falsy thing is in fact falsy is to do a double bang operator on it. Because what that'll say is, give me this false-ish thing and tell me, is it false? Great. That solves our evaluation up to the point where we've got the double bang, and then we, in the E there, we take that double bang, it evaluates to the string called true, then we take the 3 index, and then we get ourselves an E. We go further into it. This example is less educational. It builds on what we learned in the next one, in the first one, which is that this evaluates to true. And then we take the 1 index, which is your R. Finally, we get a D, which when we look at what is the 1 index of an empty array, that's going to be undefined. We cast that into a string, and then we take the 2 precedence matters, and then you get that string to be a D. There's our D. All in all, the left side is equal to nerd. And I'm missing the front of that. So at whichever point I went through the front, I cut it off, take that full question again, put it over there, and we get to true. Well, now that we've answered those 2 questions, we're joined on the call by Kevin, who had asked the first question. So I'll pause a moment here, and Kevin, if you're curious to hear the answer to the webpack question, you'll be able to review this. It's all recorded, and I'll state in very summary that it appears to me there's little benefit for you to get involved in webpack, with the presumption that you're looking to understand JavaScript without a framework as a way to understand pure JavaScript and then ultimately move into a framework. So that's where that's at. Kevin, you'd like to speak to your question at all? All right. So with nothing from Kevin there, that leaves us with our 3rd question. And for the 3rd question, that requires a speaker. And that speaker is, I want to say, going to be Joey Buszczek. So he's in the Slack now. I'm going to continue to speak while I message him and ask him would he join on this call. So as we go through and wonder what is the question, I'll say it aloud now. I've begun using React and have done a few simple tutorial projects like to-do list and tic-tac-toe. I'd enjoy hearing any aspect of React covered, but here are a couple of my noob questions to get started. When to use a component's state versus instance property to hold the value? Should I only use state when the value directly changes the appearance of the component, i.e. that state gets referred to in the render method? Also, I've read it's a bad practice to rely on ref, but I'm finding it very convenient for calling child methods from a parent component. How taboo is ref, and how to better structure a React app to avoid using ref. My example is a slot machine app that calls Reels components .spin function from their parent component. With Joey in the Slack channel stating that in a couple minutes he'll be on the call, I'll pause a moment and have for anyone on the call, and I know that the question asker is on the call, to make a comment or otherwise pause until Joey is on.
Hi, it's Doug, the question asker, and I don't really have any further specifics to the question unless something comes up while it's being addressed.
So you're beginning to use React, and this question has come as a result of building out an application.
Yes, so I started just doing tutorials where I followed along and, feel like I'm great at it because step by step I end up building what the end result is supposed to be. So then I thought, well, let me try doing one on my own. And I thought a slot machine seemed like a good candidate for components. So I started building that. And as I did, it started looking less like the tutorial examples and more like what I always write in JavaScript. Just to isolate two of the questions I had about it were using state versus using a component's property to hold values, and when you use one over the other.
So as a broad point, React is about as popular a JavaScript technology as has existed at any point in the history of JavaScript. Folks use it in many ways, in many places. It tends to be discussed in the context of web applications. Secondarily, folks use something called React Native in order to build mobile applications. Now, as a result of being a view layer, and unlike Angular, while widely flexible, it's used more than just web applications. You could find it in a lot of places, and there is many people using it. The technology has been developed over a number of years, and so the way that people use it has changed. And when you get into the point of building your own application, having the ideas of folks that have been using it for a number of years is one of the better ways to understand it. That's to say that development can be a team sport, and certainly if you're intending to get good at it, it's good to work as a team. There are companies that rely on React that they could get started with Create React App and then do the eject that I had talked about earlier and start to build in their own systems around it. Usage of React that's occurred in a local company here, Density, has been to use the same components as are used in the web application into email tools. So you can understand that an email can use HTML and it cannot use React. You can understand that having standard buttons is a part of any software platform. So if you've got any call to action in an email, you could use the React Components button in your email if only your tooling were appropriate to it. Now that is a case of using React in email where what the component is defined as is different depending on where it's used. What it exports is different depending on where it's used. So when you're using React and thinking about it in the context that the asker here is asking, it tends to be in the web context. Now, because it's possible to use it in email, because it's possible to use it everywhere, the exports need to be different. With the email, you inline your CSS and you inline your HTML, and you're dealing with certain subsets, which is to say, if your React component has stateful bits of it or has interactivity, then it couldn't work in email. So there's a certain subset of components that could work in one scenario, but not in others. So when you look at what React Native is, it is taking the ideas of React that there are components and that the exports are different. Just in the scenario where Density is using React for a web application and exporting a button in a web application context, as well as exporting it in a email context, a React Native will be exporting React components into a native context. So Joey Buszczek, hello.
Hey, Peter.
We've got it queued where the question has been asked and the asker is also on, and we're at the point of answering it. So to that end, well, timing is timing, so you can go with it.
All right, so this is the question regarding component state versus instant properties and refs.
Correct.
That's it. Okay, so I'll go in order here. So, and this is all from my experience. I'm not saying what I say is right or wrong. So component state versus instance property to hold a value. If that instance property is ever going to change, or you want it to change, don't put it in instance property, put it in state. So state is something useful where the property could remain the same between component re-renders, but you also want to change that property with user interactions. So maybe there's a counter. This is a very, very simplistic example, but say you have a counter on the screen and you want to hold the value of what that counter is currently at, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the user would click either increase or decrease buttons to increase that value, and you want to display it on the screen. You would hold that in state. You wouldn't put that in an instance property. Right. So if you wanted something to just be constant and never change, that would be something you'd have in just some property somewhere. But state is something that can change over time and typically needs to be interacted with among like most of that component tree in most cases. So a good example of state that would change over time but have access to many places is something like state management solutions like Redux or Context, where there's a component 5 levels down in the tree that needs access to something up in the parent or the ancestor, and that's how you get it there. And you can change it from there. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks. Yeah, this is the asker, Doug. And so just to be clear, like I said, I'm brand new to React. So I read somewhere early on that whenever a state changes, the component gets redrawn, which is why I was wondering if it's something that doesn't require a re-render, would you, even though it's a changing value,
so
would
there's
you still put it in state?
There's also ways that you can prevent components from re-rendering based on certain values. I wouldn't be able to properly explain it in a simplistic way in a few minutes, but suffice it to say there are ways to do that. But generally speaking, unless you have a gigantic application, those re-renders aren't going to cost you much at all.
Okay.
React is very, very efficient and fast at re-rendering what it needs to be rendering. The one thing you'll have to be careful of is if you're rendering like a large list of things, make sure that you give it a key for each item in that list. And then you can look at the React docs for more information on keys, but also make sure that key is unique. That way React can tell where it is when it's re-rendering if it needs to change its location. Again, React does this really efficiently and really quickly. So I wouldn't be too concerned about whether or not something is going to re-render or not, unless, like I said, you have this gigantic application, or maybe thousands of different elements on the screen that you don't want to be re-rendering, maybe some sort of game or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay, and for the other question for refs, so here you're saying you're finding it convenient for calling child methods from a parent component. Typically, we don't really want to do that. You want the control to go from parent down, not from pull it up from the children. Refs are very useful for tracking things in the DOM. That's what I use them for mostly. So if I need to track an element in the DOM and I need to know where it's positioned, maybe I need to recalculate padding or margins from other components or your elements on the screen based on where that thing exists. I want to track it, and I want to check every time it re-renders. I would debounce that, but every time it re-renders, I would check to see where it's located. Do I need to change any paddings, any margins? Maybe I want some sort of unique user interface where it's always centered or something like that, or always to the left. And I need to know where everything is around it. Tracking things in the DOM is really what refs are fantastic for. I know some people have used them for forms, like form fields and things like that. You don't really need to use them for that, I have found. If you're going to be calling methods in a child from a parent, it would be better to define the method in the parent and then pass it down into the child. And if the child needs to call it, do it there. Otherwise, the parent would call it in itself. But plucking things out of children to call from a parent is typically, I wouldn't advise to do that if you can help it, because it tends to be really confusing, especially if you're coming into someone else's code base and they're like, wait, where's this thing? And also you have to worry about whether the thing is rendered or not. Maybe something failed and it blows up when you try to call the method. But generally speaking, you want to avoid calling methods from children, from the parent. It just becomes more confusing, is basically it. That's my experience with it.
So yeah, I guess that does make sense. So in the example that in the case where I'm doing this, I made a slot machine, and one of the components for the slot machine is a reel, and it can have any number of reels, and the slot machine is now aware of each of the reels, and when you press spin, it runs slot machine's spin function, which in turn calls the spin function that's on the reel for each of the reels. So instead, I should just have like a spin reels function and pass it this might be something which, unless you were sitting down looking at it with me.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of say without seeing it, but if I'm trying to imagine this in my head, but you could have the function that spins the reels in the parent, right? And then, to be honest, at that point, that's where you would need to call it, and then you could just render the child reels, however you want to, based on the value, whether it's spinning or not. You don't really have to pass anything down to the child except for how it's supposed to render at that point, if that makes sense. Again, I guess I would have to see your example.
Yeah, Yeah. So it sounds like, it sounds like my reels, my reel component is perhaps a bit more complex than it should be, that I should pull a lot of its.
So are you saying that you would spin one reel and the others are supposed to go with it?
So it spins each reel independently, so they can start and stop at different times.
Oh, okay.
And then also, um, the reel has a number of methods of like which symbols are showing, um, and various other.
Okay, well, this would be a perfect example of how you could utilize state inside the parent component, and then you could pass methods down into the children, and when they're completing whatever they're completed with, they can call a method to update that state in the parent component, and then you can take it from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say that this is a discussion that's been nice to be able to go in depth on. Certainly Joey's commentary as a professional developer using React day to day is going to be helpful to Doug. And, should this reel get spinning, I think we'll all have to come back in a month and find out. We are about at the point where we've answered the questions that came in today. And with 3 questions answered, I'd say that there's been some education delivered to anybody who's decided to tune in and listen. We'll continue to do these, and we'll continue to answer questions, ask questions in the Slack channel like I described in the beginning. And that's a wrap for Syracuse JavaScript office hours. Until next time, be well, stay healthy.